Hello Internet, Craig Black here. How are you doing? Good to see you again. In this video I'm going to give you some details about how I arrived at the setting that I'm playing my Desmarais campaign in. It is a Pathfinder Adventure Path / Savage Worlds campaign. I thought I would do the conversion standpoint first, but then I realized as I'm doing that, as I'm starting to walk through that, there's actually a lot of things that I reference from the world which I haven't told you about yet. So I figured I'd start with that. In particular, there was a huge clutter in my brain about how to make all these things work in a way that's relevant to my players, to my group, to my storytelling way, and yet still able to pull all the story elements out of the Pathfinder Adventure Path modules that I want to in order to make this successful and finally get some use out of these modules that I purchased so many years ago. My desire is to give the players a quick familiarity with the world. Some of my players are new, none of them have played Pathfinder before, and because of that, I didn't want to spend a lot of time downloading a lot of information. I wanted to get them up, running, playing, adventuring, doing daring heroics, and enjoying themselves. Secondly, I really wanted to focus on actually using the modules and focus on getting the most out of the modules in a way that's usable to as many people as possible, but also mainly to myself. But instead of doing the world building that goes along with that. Now, Pathfinder Adventures are set in Golarion, which has the modules that I'm using are actually set in a geographically very disparate location. So we have some are in Varissia, some of them in Korvosa, some of them in Cheliax, and if all of these names mean nothing to you, that's exactly what they mean to my players. Nothing. And that was the challenge for me. I really wanted them to sort of be able to just get in. Now, this is an interesting setting, so I'm not in any way poo-pooing the actual setting itself. There is a lot of diversity. You can play any kind of adventure here. I love some of the analogs. Assyrian, for example, for Egypt, and Tyann for the Far East. They're just about anything you think that you could play or want to play, you will be able to play inside of Golarion. And the gods are interesting and numerous. And one of the things I really like about them is there's actually some real interesting ways that they describe to you why people might actually worship these gods. Like, for example, there's a goddess of revenge, Callistra. Well, okay, a lot of people say, oh, what are their what are their portfolios? Well, it's a god of vengeance. Why would anybody worship a god of vengeance? Well, actually in this one, there's actually not only reasons why you'd worship god of vengeance, but also reasons how their rites and rituals go, what their actual thought processes are. And that information, super handy, but not what I'm after. And the reason for that will come up a little bit later on. My solution here was to actually go to Mythic Europe. In particular, county or the Duchy of Savoy. Now, there's a few reasons for this. Number one is super familiar. Savoy is on the border of modern-day France and Italy. Everybody knows what those are, where they are, what languages they speak there. Secondly, is monotheistic, which, as I sort of hinted at before, is of importance in the worlds and games, or the worlds and stories that I'm going to be telling. Their history is our history. So when we talk about Venice or Rome, we kind of have some idea because you've either read history books or watched television shows or watched movies or consumed any type of historical fiction whatsoever. You'll know about these things. And lastly, several of the Pathfinder monsters that they'll actually be facing through these games actually originally came from Europe. Werewolves, vampires, golems, all of these things are European. And so rather than spend a lot of time translating them, we just use the original European versions. Now, the challenges that I found, of course, now that we're thinking about moving this to Europe, and in particular to Savoy, is there are two types of multiculturalism inside of fantasy role-playing. There is racial multiculturalism, and then there are cultural multiculturalism, or people culture multiculturalism. Oh, say those things real fast. People, elves, dwarves, etc., they are in a lot of ways considered to be their own cultures. But if you think about a dwarf that dwells in one society and a dwarf that dwells in another society, that actually sort of makes that multiculturalism even greater. Are they first dwarven, or are they first German or French or Shoanti or Chalaxian? What do they identify as? Secondly, that is secondary to the actual culturalism themselves. Like if you look at Pathfinder, they have a lot of people described in Pathfinder who are Varisian. Well, what is a Varisian? What is Varisian versus Shoanti? What are Varisian versus Chalaxian? So that's one of the first things I have to do, is to create some analogs for those people, so that when I'm converting them, when I say a Shoanti person who shows up isn't just going to be another background character, I'm actually going to say, okay, Shoanti, I've done some conversion here, and Shoanti in my game is X, German, perhaps, whatever. We'll figure something out. Secondly, we have to do something with the multiple gods and religions, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on, but there are a lot of different gods, a lot of different religions. Some of them can feel a little bit haphazard because there are so many. Which one do they have cathedrals to or temples to, etc.? Geography isn't really a challenge. Like if you look at the map of Varisia, it appears mainly empty, and there's not really a lot of cultural hinges to put those things onto inside of this actual map. Several of the things that we're going to be dealing with, they are geographically dispersed by a long way. So if I want to tie them together, I either have to move them, which isn't really a problem, or I need to somehow find a way to culturally centralize them. So in my particular case, all of these things will be in or around the areas of Savoy, okay, which is much smaller than Varisia, meaning that travel won't present a huge challenge for them. There are going to be some fuzzy areas inside of Europe where things that I say happen in the game are obviously not going to happen in real life, but we'll walk through those together. So if we look at Savoy, Savoy is on the border of modern day France, Italy, and Switzerland. There are many cultures. Savoy actually had its own culture. Savoyard or Piedmontese, I'm probably butchering those things. Even though I've studied a ton of history, Savoy to me was relatively new. However, the thing I like about it is that it is a crossroads of a variety of cultures. You have the warlike French. To the south, you have islands which are governed by the Spanish. You have the Italian city-states who hate each other. And just to the north, you have Austrians and Swiss. So there's a real possibility here for a cross-pollination of cultures, which of course to GMs, such as yourself and myself, these mean adventure. These mean wars and conflict and political intrigue. All of those kind of things which occur inside of the adventure path can easily find a hook or a knit inside of the fabric of Savoy, which will allow them to be integrated easily. Secondly, there is mountainous areas in proximity. Mountainous areas in cultures have traditionally mean less populated, meaning that for all of those dungeon crawls and those remote locations where big bad things live, there is a logical place for me to put them inside of the world where people can travel to. Historically speaking, many people in Savoy, even in the early 17th century, still had a belief that fairies and giants lived in the mountains. All I'm doing is making that real. And lastly, to the south is the Mediterranean. And the Mediterranean, of course, beautiful, but also a thoroughfare for culture. The Africans, the Barbary pirates were still a thing, right? Could they be an analog for something that exists in one of these games? Perhaps. But you could go all the way to the Middle East via the Mediterranean. And those cultures make it easy for me to introduce foreign elements into the game, which of course mean adventure. The arrow that I'm doing and the arrow that you see on the map, so my map is right there, it looks like, is 1600. So it is a relatively quiet period for this area, meaning that we don't have to worry about, if I'm trying to maintain historical accuracy, a lot of wars trampling on these adventures. It is after the discovery of the New World, which means that a lot of the luxuries and the cool stuff that came from the New World now exist inside of Europe. So we're talking tobacco, sugar, etc., coffee, things that are luxuries in this day and age, but people like I can relate to them, right? It's not a fictional vice like Lotus, for example. It is an actual, real, tangible thing that my players and I both can relate to. And lastly is before the Great Revolutions. So Europe during this time underwent a variety of great revolutions, the French Revolution, etc. These revolutions changed the thinking politically in the world. Democracy became a thing after this. There were republics during this time which were theoretically democratic, but in reality they were ruled by aristocrats. Because of that, it allows me to still have kings, queens, nobles, and aristocrats, which is a flavor that I really like in games that I tell. Religion and magic. So I'm borrowing from multiple sources here. One of the ones I'm borrowing from is Fading Suns, and then finally All for One. These are both remarkable settings. Fading Suns is a setting based in the distant future after a lot of crap has happened, and this originally I became involved in years and years ago, but one of the things that I really loved about it, one of the brilliances of it, was this idea of a central Orthodox church, but there were also subcultures underneath that church which make for gameplay very interesting. So I'll be borrowing whole cloth from Fading Suns for a lot of my religiosity. Is the Orthodox Church, which is basically the main church. This is kind of considered to be the traditional, church that people would go to every Sunday. They are focused mainly on worldly events, but also, in the game, the saving of souls, and most people belong to this. Then you have the Inquisitors Church. Now, the Inquisitors in the game in Fading Suns are those people who root out a variety of, forbidden technologies and all of those kind of things. In my game, the Inquisitors mainly hunt witches and wizards and sorcerers, people who use forbidden knowledge. Okay? Now, I'm going to basically make them sort of fanatical branch of St. Dominic. So they're Domitians, who were, historically speaking, people who were responsible for the persecution of heretics, in particular the Cathars, the Bogomils, but a variety of others as well. This order actually was specifically designed for that, to counter those heretics, which makes them perfect candidates for Inquisitors. I am going to say I apologize to anyone who is of Catholic or Christian faith. My goal here is to provide a good gaming experience, not necessarily to make any commentary on church whatsoever. Brothers Battle, also from Fading Suns. These guys feel like the militant order of St. Michael, responsible for basically the leg breakers of the church. Warrior monks, not Templars, because of course Templars have their own mythology, but actual loyal fighting order monks who were responsible for enforcing the will and protecting the church. Amaltheans. Now, Amaltheans in Fading Suns are basically your all-round healer. If something is desperately wrong with you, if there's anyone in the galaxy who's going to be able to save you, it's the Amalthean. I'm actually thinking about making them followers of the order, somebody like St. Basil, who was responsible for the building of hospitals, and they're known for healing and pacifism. So they, are they great healers? Yes. Will they go to war? No. So you might find them on the battlefield, wandering around, almost like the Red Cross or the Red Crescent today, considered neutral on the battlefield, sacrosanct. They'll heal anyone, but basically powerless to defend themselves. And lastly, and perhaps most controversially, is a group of monks called the Eschatonics. Now, Eschatonic monks, these are kind of an interesting idea. They were monks in Fading Suns who are given the gift from the church to use the tools of the enemy against the enemy. In this case, sorcery, magic. In my game, in this mythic Europe, I have made the Eschatonics the followers of Simon Esca, who was an unknown and entirely secret disciple of Christ, who was charged by Christ with the fighting of the enemy with their own weapons. He's a Greek scholar, a contemporary of, this guy, Jesus, who wandered around. But he was always in secret. And so one day he met in secret and said, Eska, there is great knowledge in the world, and that knowledge will be yours to use against the enemy. Now, magic will also have lay practitioners, so people who do not belong to the church. These will be sorcerers and witches, both of whom who get their powers basically from an otherworldly power. Now, this otherworldly power generally is not good, right? So they'll be sorcerers or something along that line. But there are some who could be considered to be neutral, okay? And those are the spirits of the land, like the fairies, okay? Not necessarily fairies. I probably won't have a ton of fairy lore inside of my game, despite the fact that it was really big in Mythic Europe. Mainly the reason for that is because I don't want it to feel too much like the game Ars Magica, where fairy magic was a huge thing. I want it to feel a little bit more natural, almost like druidism. But that said, both of these are dealt with an amazing amount of suspicion by both the rulers and the church. The rulers, of course, think that they're incredibly useful, very powerful tools, but also incredibly dangerous, kind of like having a hand grenade. Is it useful for destroying your enemies? Absolutely. Could you blow yourself up? Absolutely. You just got to figure that, which one of these things are you doing today? Of course, they will also be victims of inquisitors. What I really want to see here is that people who are wielders of magic, when they wield magic, they understand that they are perceived in the world to be otherly. They are perceived to be not of this world, not natural. And thus they scare children and peasants and people who are uneducated, meaning that magic use, which can be quite graphic in Savage Worlds, needs to be circumspect. Your practitioner of magic may be a magician, but he'll probably know how to do other things as well. He'll probably know how to defend himself in battle because he can't always haul out the fire blasts, etc., because he doesn't want to scare the locals into calling the Inquisition. For a hometown, I am going to use Sandpoint. I am going to situate it on the coast of the Mediterranean, about 20 miles east of Nice, in a place where it now is called Roquebrune, or Rochebrune, depending on how bad my accent is. It is before Monaco, but it is actually a place. There's actually a cape there, and there's a small town which historically was beholden to Nice, which is kind of neat. It will have, at this point, just have fallen into the hands of the Duke of Guise, who himself is a servant of the Duke of Savoy, and he will have been tasked with basically reassimilating it into the Duchy of Savoy. The town will be partially created by the players. I've basically sort of broken out, or I've begun breaking out into Excel spreadsheets, all of the different people inside of the land, or inside of the town, what they do, who they are. I've done some conversion because there's some names I don't really like, there's some names that don't fit, there's some races that don't fit. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to break them basically out into goods, what they can sell to players, services, what they can provide to players, production, what do they produce for the town that actually makes the town valuable? And lastly, government or administration. Provision of things that basically make the town efficient. These would be things like guards, constables. I've actually already done this part. And so what I'm going to be doing is doing this retrospectively. My players now played a couple of sessions already in this world, and it's been a hit so far. So I hope that continues. You continue watching from here on. After this, I'm going to go into a little bit more depth about why I've chosen some of my concerns. If you're not really interested in that, you could probably turn off here or move on to the next video. But if you are, stick around. Otherwise, if you are going now, good to see you again. Hope to see you again soon. Thank you. Why Fading Suns? Well, okay. I played a game called Emperor of the Fading Suns by Holistic Design, and I discovered they had a tabletop game. It had all of these different elements in it. It felt like Dune with swashbuckling and Star Wars kind of all pressed into one, and a little bit of Cthulhian horror topped over the top. I played a campaign using Savage Worlds because it's a go-to for me. I loved it, but it was incredibly complicated. There were so many elements. There was technology, and then there was magic, and your starship needed a guy who could fix the starship, but also somebody who could make sure that it wasn't eaten by the void krakens that happened to dwell in the in-between. My players found it a little bit challenging because there were so many different elements to focus upon, right? You had armored battle suits and robots, but people fought with swords. And to them, like there was you really had to be able to get into that atmosphere. So I had a couple of players who really enjoyed it. We actually went on to play a very brief campaign, about 20 sessions or so, about a swordsman from a house that specialized in assassins and his alien comrade. And the alien comrade had been saved by the other guy, and so he was forced into eternal servitude due to a blood debt until he could actually save this guy's life. The interaction that went on between these two was just priceless. It was wonderful. But like I said, most of my players, actually, it was just too much data to actually process. They wanted the story, but they didn't necessarily want to have to learn an entire mythology because they were playing in this game. The other one is All for One. All for One is originally a game for Ubiquity. They came out with this All for One setting, and then they converted that to Savage Worlds. And it was in the Savage Worlds form that I got it. Now, it was on sale one day. I purchased it because I play a lot of pirate games, and I like anything that has to do with swashbuckling or anything along that line. And I needed a good source book for the time period, and it was excellent. The fellow who wrote it, he really had a good grasp on how to turn a historic world into an adventurer's world. There was statistics for stuff that I never bothered to research, cannons and ships and things like that. Fantastic. I really liked the system that he created for handling magic. Savage Worlds has always been one of those problematic systems for me when it came to handling magic. Sometimes it felt like, oh, you had these two things that you could do, but that was it. And so it made your players feel kind of like, well, if I'm not doing this or not doing that, I really don't have magic. Whereas what he put into play made it way better. Well, in my mind, made it way better. And it's actually the system that I've used to play Magic ever since I bought this system. Thirdly, whatever, wherever we are, he provided dozens of secret societies and organizations which I have borrowed from heavily in several games, in 1930s pulp games, in historical games set in different worlds, in historical games, in pirate games. There are just dozens not dozens, I would guess there's probably about 20 or so secret societies which all have amazing motivations and history. And those to me are the two most important things for running a secret society. You know, you can know who the people are, but if you don't know why they're doing what they're doing or why they're trying to be secret, it doesn't really feel like that valiant of an effort to defeat them because you don't really know what they're trying to achieve. And it also had some pretty decent conversions for monsters. So the werewolves in it, I think, were a better take than necessarily the ones out of the regular book. So I just really respected the work that he did, and I'm actually happy that I'm going to be able to use a lot of this, cut it whole cloth, and patch it into this game. Thanks for sticking around for a little bit of extra. I'm a bit of a grognard when it comes to gaming systems, and so what occurs is it's always nice to be able to discuss these things. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to ask me down in the comments, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks, and have a great day.